this evening, quite timely because it is the Ratty Arms Beer Festival this weekend. Peter is going to take a look through the history of the Ratty Arms building, the railway around it, and what happened when Lord Wakefield and Douglas had their crazy idea. So over to Peter. If you can't hear us or anyone, just type in the comments and I will prod him. So Peter, it's over to you.
Thank you. Let me get rid of something from my ears. We'll see how we go. Good evening and welcome. I'm frightened that it's 50 years ago since we got thrown out of the Ratty Arms. My wife and I used the living accommodation for the first season that we were here working on the railway. But we knew that it was only going to be 10 years to shoot. And it was quite a nice place to be. Trains outside and lots going on. It won't be a history of the Ratty Arms as such, but more of the trains and things train-wise that you might see around. But with the proviso, there won't actually be as many trains as Dave usually provides for some of these evenings. But let's see how we go. Ratty Arms at the top of Station Hill. Trains passing outside on the main line, backwards and forwards. It's amazing that it's still there. 50 odd years ago, it was fairly uncertain that it would be still there. It was certainly uncertain that we got two lines in front of the station. And we were only a decade after Mr. Beeching had wanted to close the whole line between Barrow and Whitehaven. So, in a way, it was potentially then on borrowed time, and it's managed to borrow another half century. But when you look down the track, the other bizarre thing which will come out of what I'm going to talk about is that it wasn't intended to be a rural highway. This was actually going to be the main line from London to Scotland. And the guys who were behind it projected this was going to be the high-speed route. All the projections that anybody wanted to invest in to do with Ravenglass all went to the wall because nothing materialised, as you'll find out in a bit. But the miracle is that had we had George Stephenson, as it then will be, deciding to put a railway line around here, then you wouldn't have had the opportunity to get on and off a train. The things will be spinning through at 125 miles an hour, and there will be no local services whatever, just as on the East Coast or between Lancaster, Penrith and Carlisle. Anyway, George Stephenson was the man, and you can see his slant on the railway on the landscape, because if you end up with a very simple layout of the track, it's almost toy train line. You have a straight, and then you have a curve to go around something. We've got George Stephenson. Right, am I speaking?
They can hear you because I can hear that talking. So yeah, carry on, Peter. Carry on.
I'll bash on. Right, George Stephenson was the man who came along and worked out this was the place to take the mainline railway that was going to carry on up into Scotland. And he got dragged in by this fella, a man called Sir Humphrey the Fleming Senhouse. He's in his Admiral's uniform, which is quite useful for him. It didn't do him any good. However, what he was doing was drumming up support for a main line up into the wilds of the Scottish outback. And this was his first public meeting in this part of the world in 1836, trying to drum up local support to join up the manufacturing towns of Lancashire and the south of England with Scotland, the most desirable line of road, and to promote the formation of a railway and get an engineer to make a survey. Well, they changed their name. It then became the West Cumberland, Caledonian West Cumberland and Furness Railway. And the following year, they came along and they were again more public meetings trying to get people to put their hands in their pocket and get a railway surveyed. Again, a year later, it changes its name, and this time it's got the Morecambe Bay Enclosure Company, because what they were aiming to do was run down the coast on the easy land, passing on to the then being built Maryport and Carlisle Railway, and then cross the estuaries at the south of our county, across the Duddon, and then right across Morecambe Bay. And it sounds extraordinary, but they'd worked out if they just put some piles down and rock in the bottom, the sea would actually build up sand against this and almost make their own embankment. They then only had to protect it. But in practice, when they actually came to build a railway around the coast, the one that we now travel on, basically what they did was scrape sand off the beach, make a heap of it, put some clay over the top and put stone over that to stop the sea washing it away. And that's worked beautifully for 150 years until somebody punctured a drain pipe, and the derailment we had recently at Grange-over-Sands washed out some of the sand. But Stephenson's idea, and people who followed him, did have a certain practicality. The slight issue was that the man pushing the idea was, as I said, an admiral. He'd been sent out to China. He got involved in the Opium Wars. He was in charge of a fleet that was bombarding Canton. The fleet did very well against the Chinese dunks. They were forced to take in opium. This is a drug war in the opposite direction to the ones we're now used to. Unfortunately, he got fever on land and is buried at Macau. And the only thing that came back was a Chinese bell with a crack in it that resides in Gosforth Church. And that basically held up this process of getting a railway on paper, then into practice, because at this point, the government stepped in. The government didn't do an awful lot of stepping in on railways. Once Parliament had decided you could have a railway, they left you to get on with it. It wasn't interference all the time, but on one particular thing, they were fairly firm. They wanted to get to Scotland. Whether they wanted the troops to get there quickly and easily, I've really no idea. But basically, the two routes involved the same amount of railway construction, because there was already a 35 mile railway at the top end between Carlisle and Maryport. And the add-on to go round to Lancaster was the same as the direct route from Lancaster to Carlisle. But Lancaster to Carlisle was the route over Shap that gained the government authority and a bit of funding from other people, and the coast route didn't get anywhere until local people decided to build it in piecemeal sections. They built a section from Maryport down to Whitehaven, and then they drummed up support for another section down from Whitehaven to join up with the Furness Railway that was being built in the south of what was our old county. And you can see George Stephenson's got his name on the moniker there as well. Now, this railway was set off from Whitehaven, but not completely along the course of the line that we know today. The north route from Whitehaven to Maryport was not connected to this south one for several years. There was a harbour and a busy town in the way. So the railways started in what is now the area for a big shopping centre, and it joined what is now our route at a place called Corkicle, south of the town. It then followed out into the countryside along the coast to splendid places like Seascale and over bridges that needed to be designed and constructed. This is the plans of a bridge that was going to go over the River Ert. Similar bridges were going over the Calder and then further down the Mite, and much greater bridges over the Esk further on. They're timber trestle bridges, not the sort of thing that the trains run over today. And the first train ran on the 19th of July, 1849. just after midday, and arrived in Ravenglass because that was all the line that they built. This is not quite their first engine, but this is an early engine. I think it's called Phoenix, and it was a 222. The Whitehaven and Furness Junction had some eccentric looking engines, not quite the sort of thing that you'd see today, or even imagine as a railway. They really did look antiquated. They're painted dark green, and the railway had a tremendous reputation for, well, idiosyncrasy, should we say. However, extending from Ravenglass south was a question of getting the tracks through a big cutting beyond Ravenglass. They dug through south of the village, and what now we regard as Roman territory in those days was unknown archaeology. The guys, the navvies digging the tracks, dug into 3 big chambers full of interesting things and a gold coin of Emperor Vespasian. So there were remains that people were interested in. It kick-started an interest in digging around Ravenglass at the time. But ahead of them, they got something much, much bigger. They got across first the River Esk and then further down the Duddon, and potentially go much further to cross the big sands towards Lancaster. There's an enormous timber viaduct over the estuary of the River Esk, and they just about finished it. They were going to expect the Government Railways inspector to pass it, when unfortunately somebody tarring sleepers managed to set fire to the bridge, and it was going well by the sound of things. When they managed to discover it, they had to tear down bits of the bridge to stop the fire spreading, and it took some work to get the railway organised for its actual opening. First of all, again, further south, much greater bridges, again crossed with timber trestles, and the grand opening was in 1850 in Broughton-in-Furness, right off the current main line, because that's where the junction was with the old Furness railway that had been built around the little town of Barrow-in-Furness. The engines that ran there were the copper knob type, and one of the first 4 copper knobs still resides in the museum at National Railway Museum at York. So this was the link to the south. Now, the railway was completely disconnected to the national main lines when it first opened for several years. It ran into the Furness Railway, and the Furness Railway in those days ran between Barrow and Dalton-in-Furness and out up towards Kirby, but it didn't have a connection to the rest of the world that was later built along through Ulverston and Grange-over-Sands to Carnforth. So it was isolated at that end, and at the northern end at Whitehaven, again, it was isolated. It wasn't connected to the wider world. It took time and money. They managed to get, first of all, an Act of Parliament to build a tunnel at Whitehaven, the one that you travel through today between Corkicle and Whitehaven Branksea Station. And at the same time, on the same Act of Parliament, they wanted a harbour branch into the estuary at Ravenglass. And this is the site of it, the area just effectively before the Roman fort. And there wasn't a harbour branch, obviously. But it's interesting, we can possibly look and see why people were interested in Ravenglass as a harbour at that time. Maybe now, with 100 years of nothing really happening, it's difficult to think of Ravenglass in any other way than a little hidey hole. But the first maps that were made of the country, this was Charles II's hydrographer who'd been mapping all the estuaries, all the harbours in the country in the late 1600s. He had managed to work out the Cumbrian coast in great detail. And although you can't necessarily pick it out here, there at Ravenglass, you've got the two rivers joining and going out into the sea, the Esk and the Mite, and the Urt would have come out a little bit further north up the coast. Eventually, when the maps of the district were being worked out from the land point of view, the earliest map of Ravenglass in the 1700s then shows the traditional estuary that we now know with the three rivers joining together. And that seems to have happened in great storms that happened about 1713, 1715. So there had been a harbour at Ravenglass that was more open to the sea. It was, well, relatively cheap to get in because the harbour that was then being expanded north of us at Whitehaven had fees chargeable to the lords of the manor of Lonsdales, whereas you could get into Ravenglass but free. And to improve navigation, just before the railway age in 1823, an enormous pillar was put up. It wasn't a lighthouse as such, because there was nothing inside it, but it was an enormous pillar. You can see the size of the person at the bottom. And this was on Newtown Knot, just south of Ravenglass, and it was to align with different features that would guide you through the sand dunes. So there was an expectation that Ravenglass could once again be an important and useful harbour. And even until the outbreak of the First World War, ships this sort of size came in on a fairly regular basis. This is the Isabella, the actual last ship into Ravenglass in 1914. It brought guano, seagull manure, SH1T. And by comparison, what we ought to bear in mind is that when the railways were first built, 1846, 7, 8, 9, there were two places that were almost identical in size, Barrow and Ravenglass. A couple of hundred people lived there. They loaded ships up. The Furness Railway organisation basically took over Barrow and put money into developing all sorts of facilities there. It was both to get the iron ore that was mined in the district out, but also to bring things in. And they turned Barrow, this is 1860, just when Ravenglass was being considered for development. This was Barrow, an enormous harbour, and they brought in materials from outside, built factories, and of course the big thing that really drew Barrow on was putting the steelworks up later. But there was all this potential and intent to do things, and this was there in the offing at Ravenglass. Now, in the offing at Ravenglass meant that other organisations were interested in what went on. So the Whitehaven Junction Railway, the Northern Railway out of Whitehaven, got amalgamated with the London North Western. It didn't get amalgamated, it got taken over. They wanted to take a share of all the traffic that was going in and out of the mines and the industries of the West Cumbrian area. And meanwhile, at the same time, the Furness Railway Organisation, because the people who were financing it, the Devonshires and the other wealthy people around Barrow and Furness, wanted to develop their organisation. They wanted a share of this traffic, and they basically made an offer to the Whitehaven Company that it couldn't refuse and took them over. And all this has a bearing on what went on, what would happen, and what did happen in the district. Now, Ravenglass Station at the time, and this is in the about 1865, when the takeover took place, would be a simple wooden building. This is Nethertown, a little bit further up the coast, which kept that wooden building right to the end of having a station there. But that would have been at Ravenglass, and there was a single line up the main route with a couple of sidings, one back to a goods shed, another up to the coal depot. Relevant in a minute, because the traffic wasn't so great, they could control it running on the single line until one day in 1866, things got a bit slippery and they needed not to pass the train in its usual place at Bootle. Trains needed to be moved so they could go past each other at Ravenglass. Meanwhile, the goods train was in the way. And so the little engine that appears on the next picture, number 19, Lonsdale, was shunted into the coal siding to get it out of the way while the two passenger trains went past. And once the two passenger trains had gone on their way, Lonsdale was shunted out of the coal siding. And then after a due delay, it set off with great vigour towards Whitehaven because there were some delays incurred. And unfortunately, somebody hadn't set the points. So it trundled off back down the coal siding and ended up basically at the foot of Station Hill and the main road. However, this sort of thing was a stimulus to what would happen later, because the Furness Railway didn't buy this line for peanuts. It wanted it to develop traffic and enrich its own resources. The next thing it did was to sort out the issues. The issues included these timber bridges, which when the trains went over too fast, rocked about and swayed. So first priority was to improve the bridges with proper masonry foundations, iron and later steel girders on top. This is the bridge over the River Esk, and it was going to be wide enough for two tracks. And in fact, this was the first bit of this northern section of line, which was double tracked. Eventually, most of it up to Sellerfield was double tracked. At Ravenglass, they had a similar development, only in this case, they reduced the width of the crossing so that big embankments on either side, whereas the original timber bridge carried across the full width of the River Mite. And they put down, with the two tracks, new platforms and new buildings. The interesting thing here is that when the platform on the upside down towards Barrow-in-Furness was being built, it had to cross over the main road. And you can see there the bridge as it used to be before the big renewal a few years ago. And the interesting thing there is that the platform's carried on that lattice girder bridge, and it's on the top of columns. And those particular columns, there's only two of them here, actually were left over because the railways had actually got an obligation, because they'd got an Act of Parliament to cross the River Duddon direct. And the original developments, everybody was going to get a direct route out of the district. And eventually the initial railway went round the edge because they couldn't afford to cross the central. It was too, what should we say, unknown, extravagant. And then the Furness Railway ended up with an obligation to cross. It got the materials together, which would have been cast iron columns like this and lattice girders to go on the top, and it reneged on the obligation that it was technically in, and it kept the train fare down from Milham to Barrow as a result, but it never completed what it should have set out to do. These two columns were left over because a bridge that was over the Duddon was built with columns like this inside. So very interesting historically, and a little sad when they survived the bridge being restored, but then were removed very quickly overnight and disappeared. Now, there are other things happening at Ravenglass around the station that we now have. Before it was actually completed, there were projects to build railways down from the mountains, and this is the one that we wonder about, because this was set up by a gentleman called Faithful Cookson. It was a series of railways that were called the Whitehaven Iron Mines District Railways, and there were several of them, different parts of the county. One group here and another group in the area around Kirkland and Rowra up into the hills. And the thing was that at Ravenglass, the railway was going to connect into the main line. This railway that was going to be up Eskdale to serve the boot mines would have connected directly in and would have been obviously standard gauge. And at the top end of the village area, they got permission. These are all things that were put to Parliament to burrow underneath the main line through the bridge that now carries the trains over the road. As it happened, this didn't come into fruition, but the next scheme started to partially. This was the one that we actually now know as the Ravenglass-Eskdale Railway, separate developments, not connected in because it was effectively built as a narrow gauge line, but it also had a harbour branch, and that's inactive in Parliament. The parliamentary powers are still there. Whether the company currently wants to have a harbour and appear in the middle of the estuary, I think we'll leave that to them.
It could be something for the 150th.
There we are.
Will didn't have that on his list.
Well, it might be, because you've still got the authority to put a train round the edge of the village green, and I've forgotten how many 100 yards out into the middle of the estuary. At the same time as this was happening, we're now talking about 1873, buildings were put up that are still there to this day. This is recognisably the Ravenglass station, just before all the changes to the workshops that took place. But the station building on the west side, the left-hand side, the goods shed on the right-hand side, they're the buildings that we know and love. They were standard Furness Railway designs. You can see them in different places, built out of brick in Haverthwaite, or in here, sandstone coins and granite round the edges. And accompanying them, a wooden shelter on the other platform. But more interesting technically was that, possibly because the little incident that we just talked about would be fresh in everybody's minds, a signal box. And this was the first bit of the Furness Railway to have, in inverted commas, proper signalling. So there were a series of signal boxes put up, and the one at Ravenglass was sited on this plinth so that they got good vision of the whole station area out of the signal box. As we say, there was a railway being built outside, and literally 100 years ago, a few weeks ago, this advert would have, 150 years ago, a few weeks ago, this advert appeared in the local papers. They wanted 50 navvies to start digging and laying the railway, and that's an interesting thing that we might develop on a future talk, because these are the guys who came to do the work. And these are old pictures, I know, but the nice thing is that the young man in the middle is offspring and still come to the railway to this day. They're the Wilson clan, the Wilson connection. But anyway, we have that railway being built separately on the edge of the Furness Railway developments. But even so, the Furness Railway developments are quite impressive. Big goods shed, cattle dock, and little crane. And it's extraordinary to think that people thought this was, what should we say, appropriate to the amount of traffic that was going to actually be developing in the area. This was put in for what they thought might happen. The Ravenglass was about to change quite dramatically, but in a limited way. The original houses were like the old sack down at the bottom end of the village street. That survived until the 1920s with its seaweed rush-covered roof. But in the rest of the village, you had quite important townhouses, mixed architecture, where there were, from the left of the picture there, the oldest modern house in the village, dated 1869, through to the posh houses at this end. And the end result was traffic on the railway through that station. There were cattle coming in because to the left-hand side of the picture, the west of the main line, there were the butcher's fields. There was a traditional traffic in cattle through this organisation, and the trains rattled backwards and forwards, carrying more goods from different places. There were one or two issues. I'm desperately trying to think. The parish council got involved because people weren't allowed on the platforms to post the mail and all sorts of things. And the railway actually had its own special sort of traffic from here, because out on the sand dunes was something that almost doesn't exist anymore. It fell away, I don't know, about 20 odd years ago, the gulls that nested there. And for many, many years, taking gulls' eggs to Covent Garden was a special source of traffic from Ravenglass station. I've lost my piece of paper that told me what these different engines were, but the previous picture with a loco on was the earlier version of the Furness Railway 060. The one that I think they built many of from 1860 onwards, and basically six-wheel version of the old machine now running at the Ribble Railway occasionally and going elsewhere, the Furness Railway number 20. This one's a much more advanced machine, and it's typical of what will be passing on the main line at that time, the turn of the century. Quite a lot of traffic moving about. The particularly interesting thing was that a lot of iron ore was moving down the coast towards Millom, and it would stain the track bed. And so the rails and the ballast through Ravenglass would be stained, even though when the traffic stopped in the 1960s, it rapidly washed through. Passengers were laterally handled by these 440s, the Seagulls, I believe they were called. And this is got mail trains behind. As I say, there was an issue recorded in the parish council minutes about people not being allowed on the platform. This one's a little later. This is about, I think, 1910. I think this is a Mary Fair, technically, and a goods train heading northbound. So the railway was busy. There was a long loop, which was individual to Ravenglass. Of all the stations down the coast, it had this extra capacity built into it, and a long head shunt beyond the footbridge and the signal box in the distance. And the signal box was heighted high so that it had good vision of either end of its shunting zone, should we say. And of course, we won't dwell too much on it, but there was, of course, the traffic for the Eskdale Railway running off to the side. Again, we don't give it credit, but it worked every day. And it worked from morning till night. And in the winter time, it was dark when the trains ran, and it was dark when the trains came back. So the big headlights that you see on the front of the engine were there for real. Of course, we know that it didn't last indefinitely. And the nice thing about this picture is actually just where the where the train finishes, there's a little incident just before the railway closed completely. I believe the local lads used to get entertainment by pushing a stick in the point blades and then flicking the handle over and squashing the stick. I mean, you know, country living keeps you occupied. Unfortunately, they didn't take all the bits of stick out. and the inevitable happened. The engine fell off the track. The driver and fireman had to put the engine back on in their own time. And Mrs. Steele of Ravenglass was very proud that when the policeman turned up at the school, her young son confessed. It cost her 50 shillings. Sorry, cost her 10 shillings. But I won't tell you what the relationship between Master Steele and Master Robbery was, but anyway, we've come to the end of the time of the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway in its various stages in 1913, and the unlikely conversion into the little railway that followed. But when we look over this lovely shot of Sansfarel in the station, beyond the station, what we now think of as the car park was the goods yard, and it was full of activity and goods. So, as I say, cattle coming to the cattle dock, other activities were involved, and it was a thriving place. And the little railway took its share of that business. Bringing the story through into the modern era, I've taken this snapshot out of the Pathé film, but there is a wonderful film that was made in about 1923, we would think, given the engines and the various situations. But the Furness Railway Baltic, the 464 tank loco in the background, was their ace machine. And they'd just been introduced 1920-21, and they were quite magnificent machines. They weren't, sadly, kept by the big company that then took over the Furness Railway. It became incorporated in the London, Midland and Scottish railway system. And that had an effect on what happened in the Ravenglass area, because instead of running trains up to Whitehaven, and these Furness Baltics, they were almost like double-ended engines, able to change from one end of the train to the other without too much fussing and work in either direction without having to be turned. They were great for going to Whitehaven, but the LMS quickly introduced through trains, so that trains ran down from Carlisle to Barrow and then beyond, so that engines needed to be bigger with tenders to capacity. So this is an old London North Western Railway, I think Prince of Wales. It's got LMS on the side of it, and it's typical of the trains that were then running immediately after 1923-24, when the LMS was amalgamated. But in the background, you can see, even though the railway station, the narrow gauge railway station, has changed dramatically, the goods shed and the station yard hasn't. But things were going on around. There were more through trains from further afield. And one of the other unexpected things that did have a tremendous effect on the survival of the Ravenglass and Eskdale was the through trains coming from the big holiday resorts, Morecambe and Blackpool. I mean, it's a good journey now, but it would have been quite adventurous for people stopping there at the time. And this would have been quite adventurous for the train crews. It's a big double-headed train. There's a cauliflower, the old L&WR engines that ran mainly between Workington, Cockermouth, Keswick and Penrith, because they were very lightweight. And I think a Furness 440 behind. I'm open to question. I couldn't read the number on the cauliflower properly, but they were not necessarily doing the job, but that would have been a good day out. This one, there's total competence, 2 LMS era Midland compounds. This is real motive power. Having brought an excursion in, parked it in the siding while its passengers have gone up and down the railway, probably on one of the max well-filled trains like River Oak was capable of pulling 260 odd people on a single train, and back in time so that they could rejoin the train, head up northwards across the, as I say, the Keswick, Cockermouth and Penrith line, and then back home via Shap. A real day out. But the number of people that it brought underpinned what was a fairly shaky organisation at the start of the 1920s. And beyond that, the number of people who came to Ravenglass and enjoyed what they saw, both wandering around the village or riding up and down on the little railway. So it spread that support about, or interest in the railway that was become so important when its life was in jeopardy in the 1950s. And those people waiting for their train to be shunted back into the station, tremendous numbers of them. But at the same time, the daily operation involved traffic into the goods yard, cattle and sundry other things. And also by now, traffic coming down from the granite quarries. And here we have the Kerr Stewart standard gauge diesel that would have taken wagons, empty wagons up and brought full ones back down into Ravenglass and then transferred across by the daily goods train, the pickup goods. And here we have them shunting into the yard. This is an early 1960s shot. It's presumably left some of its stock. I don't know what's going on here, what the shunt involved. However, it will have kept people occupied. However, we're coming into that period in the early 1950s when the granite traffic faltered, the quarries were closed, and what had been the standard gauge link was severed. So the fences across the line that would have joined beyond the engine sheds of the Ravenglass and Estelle and become that double line, the big line up to Murthwaite. And on the end of it was this little tab, BR maintenance ends. Well, thankfully, when BR maintenance ended and the sleepers were ripped up, somebody removed it and it's part of the museum collection. But this would have been the point that the main line finished and the maintenance for the track was thrown onto the private railway company. A few more shots to bring us right up to date. The average train in the 1950s could have been your Black 5 and several carriages. There were sleepers running northbound and would drop you off at Whitehaven. There was a tremendous amount of passenger traffic involved with the developments at the nuclear sites at Sellafield. And it's possibly hard to think now that this is one of the centres of engineering excellence in the country at the time. It was an area that ended up with diesels, not at the first flush of dieselisation. It ended up by default with its own local class of a very small number of, they were peculiar wheel arrangement with a six-wheeled bogie on one end and a four-wheel bogie on the other. And they had a certain reputation for not necessarily reliability. My first journey here was behind one of these and compartment coaches. One was bitterly disappointed that it was diesel all the way. One of them managed to set fire to the loco shed at Barrow, and I think this one was never going to set fire to anything that afternoon because it's been rescued. I was literally trying to find in the magazine through the reference file that somebody's put together, and I couldn't quite get there to find out what happened. And there were excursions from other places. This was one that came from Leeds, and it came on the early days of September 1960. It was the excursion that brought everybody, the SLS, Stevenson Locomotive Society excursion, that potentially was going to be the last opportunity for many people to travel on the little railway. Meanwhile, these were arriving. This wasn't the first section of line round here to be dieselised, although these are the Derby lightweights. The yellow diamond sticker on the front was a peculiarity. These were the units that were brought in at Whitehaven and actually became one of the first areas in the country to have diesel multiple units take over. They were particularly useful between Whitehaven, Workington and Penrith, and then up to Carlisle. And yes, we were all disappointed if we had to travel, except when you could look out of those windows at the front behind the driver, or look out of the windows at the back on the track developed. It was something that you actually miss out of a modern DMU. I'll particularly remember one of the last journeys we made on these traditional vehicles was something the railway organised, Martin Willey, had suggested when we had a gathering here of people from the other little railways. Well, we could get a train and get it over the Settle in Carlisle because they're going to shut it. So Douglas, bless him, rang somebody up and the train appeared. Sid and Di Pickup organised the catering. The guard's van was full of beer on trestles, food. We had breakfast, we had a morning coffee, we had biscuits, we had lunch, we had afternoon tea, we had supper. It was wonderful. We went round the Settle in Carlisle. There were so many people in each cab taking pictures. The crew were very receptive. It was a wonderful day out. So thank you, Martin, for its suggestion and the memories. However, the signal box at the end had reached the end of its time. 1965, trying to find my notes, but anyway, it was closed in where have I got, September 68. And just before that, the railway had actually, the station had become unstaffed. The sidings had been taken out of the goods yard. This is a special for the president of Pakistan, I think, going to Sellafield. But the last thing to go in and out of the sidings was, of course, the Pullman cars. They'd been in the previous shot. They were pulled out. They'd gone up to Seascale briefly. They were on their way potentially for scrapping when again there was a deal done that got them saved, and more to the point, put back in before the contractors appeared to lift the tracks over which they wouldn't have been able to travel. So we end up with no tracks into the station, and yet there's a track running alongside the main line, past the signal box now, and it is on land owned by the Ravenglass Nestdale Railway Company. What on earth's that there for? It's a long siding. It's great for shunting up and down and having a play with a visiting engine or the museum engines, but it was there for a purpose, because the original, in about 1970, intention was to lay a track along that siding, round the back of the bathhouse, the Roman bath. God knows how they got permission for that. A spiral, because every good narrow gauge railway has a spiral, and then round up to the back of Muncaster Castle. It would have been wonderful had you not had a railway between Ravenglass and Nestdale. If you're just starting from scratch, you could not have beaten it for scenery and interest. And it did have an interesting effect on the railway, because an engine was being designed to run like the Furness Railway Baltics, equally easily backwards and forwards without a tender, a tank engine. And the boiler for it actually had a level foundation ring so it could fit on. Eventually, the engine changed its shape. Graham Withers managed to scupper the idea of having a tender to ride in. He wanted, to ride inside a cabin, an enclosed cab. He got it a decent wide open space tender. But anyway, the railway organisation decided, in spite of the planning permission being there and the potential to do it, actually the rest of the railways still needed that investment in track. and there was a great risk that this would be the honeypot that would take people off the main line. And then we'd acquired, I say we, the railway company had acquired, along with other buildings on the site, the station. What on earth do you do with an old station? And it wasn't actually terribly sparkling inside. The condition of different parts of it were, well, let's put it this way, many years of neglect by the bigger organisations. That the project to turn it into the Ratty Arms suddenly gelled. I don't know who had the bright idea first, possibly Douglas. Lord Wakefield was certainly into developments, how to make more of what you've got. And this was a classic case. There's the foundation works for what would be the toilet block. And their work is ongoing into repairing the chimney stack. My brother, bless him, I don't know if he's listening to this, but he might have words to say, because he'd gone up on the roof with Staff Roberts on that scaffolding. These stones that don't look all that big from ground level when you're 40 foot up in the air, and a coal train comes along with 25-ton axle loads bouncing on every rail joint, it moved about somewhat, let's leave it at that. So whatever happened inside was not quite just in time, but the work that went on, and you don't see any cracks in the walls now, it really was well done. That was the interior of the bar with the first management people, the Tuckers, and Douglas behind. And Trevor will probably have memories of the mock beams not holding the ceiling up at all, and the woodwork of the bar actually came out of the trees on this side of the line in the little copse round Cyril's garden. There wasn't a chainsaw to cut them down. There was the old-fashioned hack, two-man, one on the end of a big long bush, and everybody took turns, and then there was some creaking, and everybody scattered. It took a bit of time before they came back. So those timbers have a bit of story behind them. And there we have the opening actual ceremony with Lord Wakefield on the left there, the mayor, John Robinson, the chairman of the Preservation Society at the time, and I think Colin Cable behind by the look of it. And I'm desperately trying to think of the man that actually did the job. So we'll leave a veil on that. But it's matured well, I think, over 50 years. It doesn't have quite the attention from Douglas that it did when he was in office, but it was a great place to have things like this, where the railway staff, there's Mrs. Rainsford, chairman of the board, Douglas, presenting Graham Withers and Ian Smith clocks for, I think, 25 years service, and some youthful faces round behind. But more to the point, and I've lost a piece of paper where I got the recitation down, but the Guards' Lament, this was a wonderful piece of limerick that ended up, somebody's going to find it for me. I'd written it down. I beg you, please pull down the blinds when my train comes through next night. Or would you ask your patrons to hide their drinks from sight? My driver needs a blindfold, and it helps him not to see. It doesn't stop the poor man's tongue from falling on his knee. I've tried collecting tickets with hands across my eyes, but through the slits I see the pints which seem to grow in skies, just like the TV advert where a pint becomes a quart. So barman, pull the blinds down and be a ruddy sport. Written by one of the guards passing through. Well, the great thing is that was all 50 years ago, and there's still a railway outside. I say a railway outside because when it was being converted, there was a serious possibility that there would still be a single track, and the platform might actually provide the opportunity for a bigger seating area. But there's been changes over the years in the rolling stock that comes by. The building's been extended slightly. This was a wonderful shot I've nicked off the internet with an old 108 DMU being rescued by something. But alongside it are the interesting things on the Ravenglass. There's a ramp that was there for years so that Stuart Harrison could take trains readily backwards and forwards to Romney and places. There's an extra piece of line. I'm not quite sure whether it's there for the 21-inch gauge Blackpool locos or for the Groudle Glen loco that came on trial. And again, the car wash plant that hasn't survived. All these interesting things that if you actually don't remember them, will fall by the wayside.
I think it was Sea Line. The third rail, I think, was for Sea Line when they were doing the testing.
Yeah. And the rolling stocks that we now travel on has changed. There's the 142 rail cars built in Workington, the 150 type bogie rail car, again built in Workington, that used to run round in pairs and then were made into single, and the Ravenglass version, the intercity coloured rail car in its I'm just trying to think whether it's got all 4 engines, possibly then. It's in its configuration for the Garden Festival at Liverpool. There was a splendid period where we had local haul stock running the ordinary passenger services. Absolutely wonderful from an enthusiast point of view, slightly less wonderful because the reliability wasn't quite as what it should, and passengers found opening doors difficult. And then, although direct rail services, DRS, were involved heavily, we've now reverted to the 156 units, and they're splendid, they're reliable, they've been refurbished, they're quite pleasant inside. I think the only criticism we've got is that we haven't got the Ravenglass and Estelle version. And then there are things that have gone. There's the mail train that no longer rushes through 7:10 every night. It would come through at speed, really quite exciting. But we have got steam excursions. This one dates back to the 1970s, and we get them through. There'll be one this Saturday. And throughout, there's the nuclear traffic. One of the things that's changed, and I must apologise because I didn't get the picture in that Dave so carefully found for me, was one of the things that happened was an excursion train. This was actually a Norwich excursion, but it wasn't this one. It was the one that carried some big railway management. I can't remember exactly whether it was an early rail Three Peaks race or something of that ilk, but something happened where a large number of railway management had to climb up the little wooden steps to get into the mainline carriage height. So bizarrely, the investment in raising the platforms, basically what would be a one-horse town type of station, took place. And I'm very sorry I can't put in the picture that Dave found me, which was the concrete pumping apparatus to completely fill the foundations of the 2 platforms. But then again, you've got to see things. This was all 2005. I had to look hard to find out actually when it was. And then you find little developments like the station shelters changing, and the rather nice wooden one, and a story in every picture, because the Ravenglass and Estelle owned the building there. It owned the land between what is now the museum building and this shelter. It had put the shelter up, but it didn't own the shelter's land. We did a little bit in between. And all this is relevant because we were trying to organise an extension to the museum, and it depended, if it was going to be bigger and square, it depended on acquiring a sliver of land. It's, I think, 23 square metres. It was about a metre wide at one end, it's a point at the other. It was basically squared off the old platform. All sorts of issues came involved. It actually went to Sir Peter Hendy, chairman of Network Rail, through the offices of Bob Tebb, who'd given somebody a footplate ride just at the right moment. And finally, 18 years of hard graft by Trevor that had basically ended up in somebody's in tray, somebody different's in tray every few months, suddenly managed to complete the sale, the transfer, and eventually the building depended on the fact we could have an emergency exit onto our land before it touched the mainline platform. And then what happened? You have a fire in a building and you end up with changes that you would never have expected. And it is sad because thankfully nobody was hurt. Thankfully, the engines that were inside were not totally damaged. Thankfully, it didn't totally, shall we say, kill the business, because it had the potential to do that. And the restoration has been quite remarkable. And sufficient of the building has survived to go into giving a flavour of what was there. But nevertheless, it was in a conservation area, and there was an appreciation in that conservation document that these buildings had a quality. And nevertheless, we're coming to the end. It's nice that we've got little features that go back to the origins of the Furness Railway. This was a seat provided by the Trust in a little area of garden looked after by local volunteers. And again, some qualities are understood when the footbridge at the end of the station had got to a point where people bounced their way across it. It was discovered, obviously, that the floor needed something doing to it. But again, the wrought iron and the cast iron columns underneath do appear to be in reasonable condition, and hopefully the footbridge will be restored within a few more weeks. So looking out over the station area from the signal box restored by Gordon Nicol, members of the old heritage group at the time, it's worth thinking that if that harbour branch had actually been built in from about here into the harbour and had the traffic developed in possibly the ways that people aspired to, well, Ravenglass will be a different place altogether. I mean, it really is bizarre that so many people had aspirations in the Victorian period. It was ripe for being turned into a barrowing furnace, and it escaped it completely. So it's nearly what it would have been in different places. You would find in the 1820s. And if you'd like to come along this weekend, have a drink in the Ratty Arms, on the Ratty Arms.
62 beers, Peter.
What?
There's 62 beers.
Oh, good God.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter.
So it took a bit of...
That's all right. So what I'm going to do, we will have a go at muting you, and we can then hear what other people are saying. Stand by, people. This could all go wrong. And I think that is you. So, oh, you're muted. So we'll risk putting my sound on. And if I can remember how to put my own sound up. We're being very professional tonight. Right, hang on. There we are. So I can see here, we might start getting feedback. So in theory, I should be able to hear people if people wish to ask questions. But it's all very quiet. So we'll have a look at the messages and see what comes through. Oh, I know. Yeah, my audio is working. Right. So in the chat, what have we got? So Murray Tremolin has mentioned that Sodor was missing from the map. Murray has a really interesting YouTube channel and has done things about Count Louis and various other things. So anyone who's watching, if you want to have a look at some very interesting historic bits of research, have a look at Murray Tremolin's YouTube channel. It's well worth watching. Mark Harrington has mentioned something also known as the Wonderloaf. Is that a vintage reference to all diesels?
I won't make any comments at all.
Class 29.
Say again.
Metrovic class 29.
Metrovic class 29. The Boco. And he's also mentioned that the Romney guys refused to use the ramp, according to Richard Batten.
Old wives' tale.
An old wives' tale.
We've actually got a picture of them trying to push Hurricane. Literally, physically, 3 people can push it up
the ramp.
Around. Not that one.
Into the turntable.
Closer to the. I'll dig it out from next.
Yes.
And we can add in the concreting picture that we didn't quite manage today as
Yes.
well.
Didn't the man from Germany with the rail bike have a go at riding up it? Or is that just an urban myth as well?
No, I don't. I don't remember. The one we had, the Austrian man.
That might be it. I might be changing country. I'm being terribly offensive to people.
Yeah, Carl Pischel.
Yes.
It wasn't Oscar.
Mind you, you are talking because at Perrygrove they were doing a speed trial with the bike.
I've heard rumours.
Right.
I've also got some video footage.
Phil had the 152,
and
that was the record for most of the evening.
Yes.
And
what did you get,
I was
Peter?
persuaded against my better judgment, and I came in at 3 minutes.
Goodness me! So it shows that smoking pays.
A round of applause.
Oh, very good.
They were splendid.
Excellent. Very good. So that is all our messages, and many thanks for the Muncaster branch info.
Oh,
And they thought it was an April the 1st story, and then Trevor has put
good.
Excellent. We took the timber for the pub up to Staff Sawmill at Miterdale by rail and tractor and trailer. We did get rained off one day and got sent across to help with early demolition work of what is now the bar area. Those wooden beams in the bar that look like they're just stuck onto the ceiling do go through a little bit.
Oh, do they?
And one of the, because it had to be rewired when it came back to the railway company, and one of the electricians from Bainbridge's thought it was a rafter and stood on it. And so there is one now that's slightly squinty, and you can see the paint marks on it. So that's something to look out for if people are in there. But it is secure, so you're safe to stand underneath it. So yes, and funny enough, in a lot of the pictures that we can't show that we hold in the archive, various staff members down the years, Trevor often features in a lot of the pictures in the Ratty Arms. So yes,
We can take the old reprobates picture out again.
we'll probably save it for Christmas.
Yes.
Yes. Excellent. And Trevor says, "Oops." Very good. So we will thank Peter for that look through quite a topical thing, because it's actually 50 years. I'm trying to remember the thing on that we've got that was the bar bill for the staff party the night before it opened. 50 years is about next week, I think.
Right.
Yes. So it's very topical at the minute. So not only is the beer festival this weekend, plenty of beer, use the replacement bus service to get here, because the Cumbrian coastline is as reliable as ever. We've also got, there is the 50th anniversary, which I know Richard Rovery didn't go to because he was not employed at that point, because he was the year after, but Trevor definitely did.
Right.
And that I think is sometime this month. We have the bill somewhere. I think it's over there now, back on the wall. So that's very good. So we will be probably back next month, which is scarily July. And Dave has various things in the pipeline.
Yeah.
What date in July is it, Dave?
Looking like the 4th.
Well, that's right. It's the following week. I've got to go and see Father Christmas. So
Oh,
yes.
Is that election day?
I don't know. This might be welcome respite from the election.
Got feeling it's the 4th.
Yes. Oh well. So we might have to have a political abeyance, but we'll see. So keep your eyes peeled. We'll send the link out, and obviously there'll be something on Facebook. But thank you everyone for watching this evening. Sorry it has been a little bit chaotic, but these things happen, and we hope to see you all at some point soon. But thank you very much and good night.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.